Hello and welcome to today's Asia Institute webinar on the case for feminist foreign policy in Asia. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler and I'm an honorary fellow at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne and the program lead at the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. I'm also a member of the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, and that's a bit what we're going to be talking to you about today. I should start by recognising that I'm speaking today from the land of the Anawan people, and particularly on today, International Women's Day, I think it's worth reflecting on the extraordinary role that women play in First Nations communities all around our country. Recognise First Nations communities for all of our speakers today, and recognise any First Nations people who are joining us, and thank you very much for doing so to everyone. So we're going to have a fascinating discussion, I think. Feminist foreign policy might be a little new to some, but it is definitely an exciting and growing area. So just in the last 24 hours, a further country, Chile, announced that its new government of their president-elect is going to be introducing a feminist foreign policy. And that now makes it quite a list of countries from different levels of development, from different regions. And I think it strengthens that case for Australia to be seriously thinking about what a feminist foreign policy would be for us, and for other countries in the Asian region to think about what a feminist foreign policy might look like for them. So to help us go through this terrain, we have a fantastic group of people who are joining us today. So we're going to kick off with Alice Ridge. She's from the International Women's Development Agency, and has been very much leading a lot of this work with the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. She's going to be taking us through a little bit what's happening in the world from the research that IWGA has been doing. What can we see from other countries who've adopted feminist foreign policy? We're then going to turn to Grant Wyeth, who's a member of the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition and a former Asia Institute researcher, so great to have that connection. He's going to take us through a little bit the Australian case, but particularly looking at some of the things that could derail. So the potential for male backlash and how we can try to manage that. And then finally, we're going to be welcoming Ambika Vishwanath, who is from the Kubanine Initiative. She's going to be making the case for a feminist foreign policy for India based on the extensive research and advocacy that they have been doing. So thank you all very much for joining us. We're really looking forward to discussions. So Alice, I'm going to get you to kick us off to give us the evidence base so we understand what this phenomenon is and what's happening around the world. And if I may say, congratulations this International Women's Day to Alice for just being named as one of the 25 young women to watch in international affairs. Over to you.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks for having me. I also want to acknowledge I'm joining from unceded Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as all Indigenous people joining us today. As Melissa said, I'm going to provide an overview of the global state of feminist foreign policy, particularly drawing on a piece of research that we did at IWDA in 2021, which looks at the pathways different countries have taken to adopting feminist foreign policies. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Liz Gill-Atkinson, who is the lead author on this research and who has actually just completed her PhD with the University of Melbourne. So another wonderful connection. Before I get into it, I want to just share this definition of feminist foreign policy, which is one that we use in our work at IWDA and with the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. And it talks about feminist foreign policy as an approach that places gender equality at the centre of foreign policy in the recognition of the link between gender and peaceful, flourishing societies. So as Melissa mentioned, we're really seeing a growing group of countries adopting feminist foreign policies. Sweden was the first to do so in 2014, followed by Canada, France, and Luxembourg. And then Mexico became the first global South country to make this commitment in 2020, followed by Libya as the first African nation in 2021, alongside Spain, Germany, and recently Chile. So we've been watching this trend for a number of years at IWDA and advocating for Australia to adopt this approach. But we really wanted to understand more about what factors had enabled this in other countries? How had they got to this point of making these commitments, and what could that teach us about our approach here? So we conducted this research to look into this question, to understand the pathways to adopting feminist foreign policy. And to do that, we interviewed 29 people across 9 countries and in 3 languages, supported by our excellent bilingual colleagues at IWDA, including government, civil society, and academics. And we focused particularly on the experiences of Sweden, France, Canada, and Mexico, as well as a little bit the experience of the UK Labour Party, who took a feminist foreign policy commitment to their 2019 election. So in terms of what we found, the key factors, we identified 5 key factors in getting declarations of feminist foreign policies. The first factor was that FFP requires high-level political will for bold policy announcements. This meant that announcements often came as a surprise, both to civil society, but even sometimes to people working within government. It was really the case of a foreign minister, sometimes a prime minister, deciding that it was going to be their thing. They were going to do it, they were going to be bold, they were going to go out on a limb and make this announcement. And you see here in the quote that I've put on the slide from the representative of the Mexican government who participated in our research, who really talks about how they expected a gender-focused foreign policy, and what was announced was a feminist foreign policy. The second factor was that this top-down leadership was really supported by civil society creating an enabling environment for feminist foreign policy and, you know, bold progressive commitments on gender issues. So civil society weren't necessarily calling for this in name in all cases, but they were creating an environment where these kinds of announcements would be welcomed. And, you know, obviously this is something civil society like to think, but actually we heard it really strongly from government representatives as well, as you can see here with Sweden. The third factor was that these announcements were really closely linked to the personal values of the individual making the announcement. So Mexico is a really interesting example of this. There are many challenges for women's rights in Mexico, not the least of which is really high rates of femicide with largely impunity. And it's not always viewed as a progressive country on gender equality. And we actually heard that quite strongly from the feminist civil society groups we spoke to in Mexico. However, the Foreign Secretary, Marcelo Ebrard, does hold progressive views and has a track record of implementing them. So when he was the mayor of Mexico City in a previous role, he implemented marriage equality laws, he implemented expansion of abortion rights, which is really significant in a predominantly Catholic country. So he sort of had that track record and the personal values alignment to feminist values. The fourth factor was that often these announcements were driven by really pragmatic things, like the need for an announcement from government, and announceable is what it sometimes gets called in the policy space. So, for example, in the UK, the Labour Party there were really responding to the sexual misconduct scandals in the charity sector. In France, civil society groups made the connection between their feminist foreign policy and the fact that the Me Too movement was putting pressure on individual political leaders within the government. So they were looking for ways to make commitments on gender equality to try and recover some of that image of being a nation that values gender equality. So that's on the pragmatic side. The other element of that was that often countries made these announcements while they were playing a significant role on the global stage. So Sweden made their announcement while they were bidding to sit on the UN Security Council. France was hosting the G7, Mexico was co-hosting the Generation Equality Forum. So there were opportunities for global leadership, and countries saw feminist foreign policy as a way to enact that global leadership. So what are the implications for this, of these findings? So for politicians, we think the biggest lesson here is don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And what that means is make the announcement and then figure out what to do about it. figure out how to explain it to your colleagues, figure out what it's going to look like in practice, but just be bold and do it, because that process of setting a really strong vision is actually really critical to implementing a feminist approach. For those of us on the civil society side who might be advocating for feminist foreign policies, it tells us that traditional policy processes might not be the most effective in getting these commitments. So, you know, with a white paper process or some other kind of formal process, there's a lot of opportunities for commitments to be whittled down or softened. And actually, we might be better off building up our relationships with political leaders, briefing them on the concepts, and then raising awareness and discourse within the broader sector. I've included a quote here on the slide, which is actually about something that we changed our position on as a result of doing the research. So IWDA previously held the position that it doesn't matter what you call it, as long as you do it. So whether you call it feminist, whether you call it a gender policy, really what matters is what you put in practice. And through the process of this research, we sort of changed our position. We felt like if feminism is about deep normative change and transforming systems of power, then actually the boldness to use the word in your policy is kind of a litmus test for whether you're going to be bold enough to implement it. And obviously, you know, there were really mixed views on that in the research, and we might come back to some of this around, you know, I think there are some legitimate challenges in using the word in different cultural contexts. There are different connotations with Australia going out into the region and using the word feminist. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you have a feminist foreign policy, you always use that word. Something that I've learned from working with feminist movements across the region is that they are really strategic. They're feminists and they call themselves that, but not all the time. Sometimes they might use gender equality or women's rights. So they're really strategic about when they deploy the word. And I think, you know, there's obviously plenty of scope for that as well at a political level, but in terms of setting up the policy here in Australia, we would see the use of the word as really disruptive, but in the right kind of way. So just really quickly, I want to touch on what we've done in practice, which is to set up the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition. So this is a diverse group. There's a few of us here today of people working across foreign policy, security, development, climate change sectors in Australia who are committed to advancing feminist foreign policy. We really want to do that work of increasing the discourse, increasing the awareness of the concept, and bringing it into the centre of the policy debate in Australia. And so this conversation is a really important part of that process. So that's where I'll leave it. And thanks, Melissa.
Fantastic. And I just told people if they'd like to read the full report, to see more on the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition, I've given the link so you can see more there. I love that we're starting to get questions in. So if anything there sparked, if you'd like to ask Alice more, if you really want to know more about Luxembourg, for example, now's the time, put it in the question, and then she'll be ready. Now I'm going to go to Ambika next. Thank you very much. It's been really wonderful to be able to work with the Kubanina initiative and find out a bit more about your work through this. So we're going to get you to make the case for feminist foreign policy, and then we will turn to Grant, who can talk a little bit about some of the potential backlash issues. So over to you, Ambika. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the Asia Institute for the invitation to be on this panel. I have to say it's great to see both Alice and Melissa twice in 2 days, so that's very exciting for me personally. So I'm going to actually just jump off from where Alice left off in terms of the different approaches to the feminist foreign policy and talk a little bit about what that means in an Indian context. And I've been writing a couple of notes down as she was talking, so it makes a good jumping off point for us. But before I get there, so Kubanina Initiative, we are a female-led and female-founded small consultancy and think tank in India. And we started looking at this issue in 2019, late 2019, 2020, when I had the chance to meet a few of the pioneers of this space, especially from Sweden and Germany and France. And so we then started understanding what this meant both in a global perspective and what this meant then from an Indian perspective. So what we realized that some of this conversation, at least in the early, in 2019 and 2020, was a little bit rooted in the transatlantic space, as we saw from Alice's timeline, which was very helpful, is that the conversation was coming out of countries that had a certain historical context, a certain different kind of lived reality, and a different set of goals. And so we approached it with the idea, one, to say that if the concept of a feminist foreign policy, as Alice mentioned about the very core concept of feminism is transformative change, then the inclusivity, when we look at it from a global perspective, also needed to then be played into that larger conversation. And so how can then other countries that have different histories, different domestic realities, different lived socioeconomic realities, how can they contribute so that when we say feminist foreign policy globally, it is truly then inclusive, right? Because what's happening in Sweden and in Canada is very different from what's happening in Australia and in India and then in other countries. So when Mexico made that announcement, we learned more about what was happening in Mexico, Spain, and some of these other countries. Libya then made this announcement, and Chile 2 days ago made this announcement. It gives us a lot of sort of excitement. It gives us a lot of hope that yes, this conversation is growing, it's very global. And so it's very important then that we felt that India also join this conversation. I mean, for all the reasons that Alice mentioned, but also for, I would add then one more reason, is that we need to ensure that all sorts of communities ultimately are represented in any foreign policy decision that's taken from a country in a multilateral setting or in a global setting, right? And you cannot have that if a variety of countries included. So I would say in Alice's list, I'm adding a number 6 over there, which so then when India is joining and Bangladesh is joining, or when we say South Africa joins this conversation, all of those different communities are also represented ultimately in that conversation when all of these countries are sitting either in a G20 meeting or in a UN meeting, and so on and so forth, when we're talking about climate, for example, or trade, or any of these areas that one might want to look at. So where does India stand? So when we started doing this research over the last 2.5 years almost now, I have to admit, I was skeptical about India's position here and what was the possibility for India. And I am absolutely not ashamed to say that I was skeptical and that I was very pleasantly surprised. I think that's a really important point to make, especially to some of the obstacles we observe in India, is that there is actually quite a lot happening in India when it comes to a gender mainstreaming component to various aspects of our foreign policy. There is, of course, a lot more that needs to be done. But when we looked at certain areas, especially like trade, when we looked at climate, when we looked at disaster management, when we looked at climate, so I think I already mentioned climate, development aid and assistance, and then a certain ancillary sectors over here, we saw that there was a lot happening. There is a fairly good understanding of what gender mainstreaming means in these areas, but it was often very responsive to an event, to either a global event, to some sort of global disaster that might have happened, the pandemic being a very recent example over here. And it was also then responsive to what other countries might be doing, or it was in response to a partnership that we had with another country. So if that country brought on this lens, then we added that lens on. It was also very ad hoc in many ways. There was certain decisions that had been taken, but there was not necessarily a lot of follow through. So a lot of pieces of that puzzle are already there. What we have realized and what we are now putting together and advocating is that why not use these puzzles, make the entire piece, which means structure all of that a little bit from our learnings and our understanding, and create a framework. I think we're almost already there. And not only then do we create a framework for India, we create a framework for countries that might find a little bit more parallel find themselves in a little bit more parallel to India, a little bit more connect to India than they might, for example, with a Sweden or a Canada. And so then maybe we offer them a different kind of perspective and a different example to look at. We've studied Mexico and Spain, for example, quite a bit, and we find that there is learnings over there for India. So maybe another country then learns from India's experience. So I think we're very close in that sense. It requires that push that Alice was talking about. It requires it for us to be bold, but I do feel that we are on that cusp quite a bit. And a lot of our research is coming out in a report that we will be releasing in April, sometime in the second half of April. So I'm definitely going to say, please look out for that report. And IWDA, I'm going to also over here complete a plug-in for Alice and IWDA and the entire team, is that we've learned so much from them. And so I think that's really the important takeaway a little bit over here, is that you look at all the different countries that are doing this, whether they've made this announcement, whether they've made an announcement of intention, which we also feel is very important. Maybe you don't make a full announcement, you announce an intent, and the different civil society organizations that are doing this research. We learn from all of this, and then we go to the next step. I do know a country like India and several others are going to be like, no, we need to do this in a step-by-step process, and that's absolutely correct. And I'm going to end over here with a quote from the current External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, who said in an article last year that was published, he says, we need to look at three things. And this quote is from the larger article, so it is a little bit in the context of this conversation, but I think that entire piece needs to also be read. But he says, we need to look at three things here: getting more women to engage with foreign policy issues, reflect women's interests in foreign policy, and bring in a feminist perspective to foreign policy. So that's our foreign minister saying that in an article that was a public interview with him. So I think that's him being bold and signaling some sort of direction. It's a matter of now how we put that into play, I think is where we're at. And there's a lot of opportunities, I would say, for India to do this, and for India to work with countries like Australia and some of our other partners around the world to do this together. So I will end there and take any questions that might come up.
Fantastic. And yes, please, people do put your questions into the question and answer, because we're going to be coming to them shortly, and we'd love your take. So I'm now going to call on Grant Wyeth, who's remaining remarkably calm given he had a computer meltdown in the middle of this. Great to have you on the line, Grant. So Grant's a member of the Australian Feminist Foreign Policy Coalition and former researcher at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. Over to you.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks to Alice and Ambika as well for talking. I apologise for coming to you from the angle that I'm coming to you from. At the moment, I had a computer meltdown and I'm having to come in on my phone here. So it's not ideal, but we're back up and running. So I wanted to talk about, I guess, a perspective that I've been working on the last few years, about a few issues about how we think about advancing feminist foreign policy in a way that creates long-lasting positive outcomes. So I think one of the things that I think we need to really understand is that we're not advancing these ideas. So if we take the 3 R's from Sweden's initial feminist foreign policy design, the 3 R's of rights, resources, and representation for women and girls, we're not advancing these into a vacuum. They're often being advanced into highly patriarchal societies, or even societies that have strong residual patriarchal structures as well. And a lot of times we're seeing that this is actually creating a strong male backlash. And so I think one of the problems that we need to really deal with is, how do we bring men along with greater female agency? So there's been research that I've recently been looking at from a number of countries, so Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, Dominican Republic, Rwanda, that has demonstrated that increased female agency actually increases the prevalence of domestic violence. Now, this is not a problem that is unique to developing countries. So sociologists have identified an issue called the Nordic paradox, where the Nordic countries that are seen mostly as the countries that are most advanced in gender equality also have disproportionate levels of gender-based violence. And so there's a backlash to female advancement, and it's happening here in Australia as well. So here in Australia, we had some research published last year as well, which demonstrated the same thing, that women who earn more than their partners are experiencing greater issues of domestic violence. One thing that I think we need to highlight is, so the barometer that we usually use for how we judge where countries are going with gender equality is the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index, and it has two pretty decent failings, which are safety and justice are not criteria that they look at. So when we have Iceland, for instance, that for 12 years in a row has been labeled the best place in the world to be a woman, it has disproportionate levels of gender-based violence. And having spent 6 months in Iceland last year, it also has a justice system that is highly suspicious and often very hostile to women. There are currently 9 women, including an Australian woman, who are attempting to sue Iceland in the European Court of Human Rights. And I think the horrible problem, the disheartening problem that we can take from this is that education is not enough, and that often men use the skills that they gain through education as tools to entrench their power and privilege. And I think when we realize that, we're dealing with quite a wicked problem. And so I guess, how do we go about this? So if we're looking from an Australian foreign policy perspective, how do we advance the 3 Rs without creating a male backlash? So in Australia's Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan that we released last year, it had very little to say on peaceful masculinities. It mentioned harmful gender stereotypes as a driver of violence, but it delegated the mitigation of this to local women's organizations. I think one question that we need to address is this really the responsibility of women's organizations? Male violence is obviously the responsibility of men, and I think it's the responsibility of male elites as well in both developed and developing countries. I think we need to center the idea that male violence is not a women's issue. So I think this is what I've started to call the 2 pillars of the 3 Rs. The 2 pillars of the 3 Rs is that we have to acknowledge that the 3 Rs can create a male backlash. And this is not an argument that we need to tiptoe or coddle male grievance or make excuses for male violence, but we need to understand that the promotion of female agency has to involve mitigating male resentment. So they're 2 arms here. And so how do we bring men along with greater female agency? I think one thing we have to be careful of as Western countries is promoting Western values in a top-down way into developing countries through our foreign policy. Western societies we have to acknowledge that Western societies' values are moving at a whiplash speed at the moment, and this can be very difficult for a lot of people to handle. Foreign policies that promote ideas that are too far ahead of target countries risk undermining advances. So this is not, what I'm saying here is not a deference to patriarchal structures, but an argument for subtlety and sophistication. And I think we need to make localized ideas for addressing male backlash, not through a Western framing. We very much risk undermining gains if we do that. So I think one thing we need to acknowledge here, and this is in a much broader perspective is that we're in an era of what I'm calling an era of heightened male emotion at the moment. So we can see from the individual and household level to the state and international level, there is a lot of agitated men, and this is proving a highly destabilizing force. We can see this through online and social environments, but institutions, bureaucracies, political parties, states as well. We can understand that the subjugation of women is a common trait of authoritarian regimes. Many terrorists, regardless of their ideology, also abuse women, and conspiracism is also heavily weighted towards men. So these are big problems. These are big problems, and I think this is what I'm calling also the Hobbesian dilemma, where if you can understand the state was created to restrain the volatility of men, but the state also fears placing too many restraints on men will inflame their volatility. That's a paradox of how we approach these issues. I think one of the things that feminist foreign policy centers when we're addressing is how do we create security with men, not from men? And this is trying to reframe security as a way of saying men are not seeing men not as protectors, but as empathetic, cooperative, and supportive beings. And this is really, I guess, the masculinities that we have to try and create is, and that really goes to, I think, one of the central ideas in feminist foreign policy is the idea that we have to understand security and instability not as only a top-down problem that insecurity in states or the international realm creates insecurity for individuals, but individual insecurity also creates insecurity for states. I think one of the things that I think is being highlighted at the moment with the crisis in Ukraine is that we need to have a reckoning with machismo. I think Vladimir Putin is the traditional archetype of what many men think men should be. This towering figure who manifests physical strength and power and control. And this is a really damaging image. And I think you can see in a lot of how Putin's popularity in far-right discourse is very strong. And there is this fantasy, I think, that feminist foreign policy is seeking to address is that international relations cannot be about great men engaged in great power politics. This is a kind of fundamental view of politics that I think we need to, I guess, remove from our psyche. It's very difficult because I think it's firmly entrenched, because that doesn't give agency to smaller states. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment with, I guess, a lot of Eastern European states, that these states are not given agency of their own. Where these, whether it's the Baltics, whether it's Ukraine, these states are merely playthings between great powers. They're not, and I think feminist foreign policy needs to address that. So I think the pressing concern here, one of the pressing concerns, and what I'm trying to highlight here is that there are aspects of masculinity that are antithetical to peace. I think these are the lust for power and control, seeing aggression as a positive, imitation as a tool to advance interests. And I think what, I guess, as a responsibility of men, I think, and the responsibility of men who are, I guess, in my positions, who have platforms, I think we have to understand that war and chaos stem from the way men relate to people as individuals. And once we understand it on an individual level, that kind of ripples up and it cascades up to the state and international level. So yeah, that's my general thesis, is that I think feminist foreign policy requires this huge buy-in from men. And I don't know whether we're there yet. I don't think we are there yet. but I think that's the path that we need to place ourselves on.
No, thank you. This has been fascinating, and I love the way you put that sort of that problem, the need for buy-in at a time of heightened male emotion. I hadn't heard it described like that, but you're so right. There are so many angry and agitated men that we have to think, how do we bring them along? So I want to thank all our speakers. We've had so rich a discussion already, and we still have lots of time for questions and discussion. So we've got a couple of questions already in, but I'd ask everybody who's on the line, think about something you'd like to say, even if it's just a quick reaction, whatever it is, please get involved, say something. So I'm going to go, I think, probably to our first question, just because I think it might give us a bit of structure. We've got issues around adoption of feminist foreign policy, about implementation, and then about potential backlash. So Perna Sen has asked us, she's responded to something Alice said about how so many leaders just make the announcement and ask for forgiveness afterwards. But she doesn't think, Perna doesn't think that that's a mistake. So what's your response to that one, Alice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. I think you found the flaw in that turn of phrase, is that I also don't think it's a mistake. I think it's the right move, but that what you've identified, that process of bringing people along, I think is really important. And I mean, so much of what Grant has said has really touched on the risks involved if that part of the process isn't done well. So can I take the liberty of segueing into some of my thoughts on that, because there's so much to dig into with all of the issues that Grant has raised. But just really quickly, I think that what I think that is critical to this issue of backlash is understanding power. And feminist foreign policy, I think, is a framework that can help you analyze power, and it can do that from the individual level. So where we're talking about gendered violence on the individual level, all the way right up through to the level of power relationships between states, between leaders and their citizens. So I think that it really strikes me there's a lot of parallels actually with another piece of research that we did, not in the context of feminist foreign policy, but looking at the impact of women's economic empowerment programs and the experience that actually often that economic empowerment can lead to an increase in violence on the personal level. And what that comes down to is that you're shifting the power relationship between men and women, and some men will respond to that with violence in an effort to reassert that. And so drawing that connection as you have up to the state level, and you have examples like Vladimir Putin in Russia, you can really see the connections between power as the critical issue at play there. Something I think that we need to keep in mind, though, in the context of feminist foreign policy is what backlash matters. I do think there's some level of backlash that is fine and that we should expect, and a lot of it will come from men. And that's in the vein of advocacy. When you're doing advocacy, usually it's fine to alienate some portion of the population. That means that your message is really strong, and that's usually part of advocacy strategies. You want to energize your supporters. You want to speak to the movable middle, and it's kind of fine. If you spend all your time trying to convince the people who will never agree with you, then you're just wasting time. So I think it's important to separate out that kind of backlash, which I don't think matters. It's not that kind of gendered violence backlash that we're talking about here. I do think it's really important to address the gendered violence backlash and the potential that, as you say, if Australia were to be going into discussions with countries in the region and putting feminism to them as a Western concept and saying, this is something that we think you need to do because you are somehow in the wrong, and we are, as Australia, we have everything worked out. I think that would be super problematic as well. And so there's that balance in figuring out how do you elevate the advocacy that is already happening on gender equality issues in those countries, because it's happening everywhere, rather than coming in as the outsider and saying, well, we have it all figured out and we're going to tell you how to go about this.
You mean we haven't got it all figured out? Okay, I'm being good to you.
Thank you, Melissa. I just want to add on to what Alice was saying and to what Grant was saying about the backlash when we were doing our research and we had a number of these roundtable discussions and we spoke to almost 100 people across the foreign policy ecosystem in India. So that included a lot of former diplomats, male diplomats, and I think one of the points that came out repeatedly was that the concept of what feminism might be is not only about men and women, it's about a basic understanding of equality to all. And of course, in an Indian context, that means also equality to different communities, different ethnic groups, different peoples across this country that are very varied. So that concept, and so it's not, sometimes I think for us at least, it's not about a man or a woman, because you can have a non-feminist woman and you can have a very feminist man. It's about making sure that everybody understands that basic idea, that basic value that you're coming from, and that lens that you're using, and then taking everybody along with you in that sense. And of course, the backlash is more from the male sections of society. There is no doubt about that in various forms. But in India, at least, and I don't know about Australia, but other countries, there is a certain amount of backlash from a certain socioeconomic group of women as well. There is no doubt about that, right? So how do we speak to that, I think, is important. So in that sense of what Alice was saying, that country context becomes it becomes even more important to understand and ensure that definition is tweaked as required, then, so that you're not coming in from the outside. And I 100% agree with Alice, is that you're going to get all sorts of backlash. Some of it is just a little bit of noise. We need to, as much as possible, move beyond that and speak to that middle ground, the undecideds, and bring them over the fence. And then, then you have a larger group to speak to the ones who have already decided that this is a bad thing, right? And that changing their minds, then it's going to be that much harder.
No, thank you. And that distinction you made between the feminist method, which is all about looking at structures of power and exclusion, versus the aim of gender equality, I think that's very important to make that distinction. I'm going to turn to, I suppose, another sort of backlash, if I can put it that way. We have Quentin Wang, who has joined us from Canada. And I think there's a concern there, as Quentin's expressed it, that since Canada has launched its feminist international assistance policy, there's been a critique that the policy hasn't gone far enough. It hasn't met feminist expectations, and that perhaps it's taken the term feminism and warped it as box ticking becomes more important than systemic change. So I think that's another dangerous backlash, as it were. Who'd like to start with that one? Unmute yourself if you want to go.
Yeah, I think so. There was an article in Prospect magazine a few months ago about pinkwashing, which is I guess what is being identified here, that maybe Canada is engaged in pinkwashing, and that these are ideas that it's promoting because it believes that the state looks good in promoting these things, but it doesn't actually have a serious commitment to them. And so that is also, I think that's a danger, I think. Whether or not that's the case, I think maybe that's something, Trudeau himself gets, I guess, accused of this a lot, that he just puts on a face, and he's not really, he's a bit of a hollow man. He aligns himself with ideas, but he doesn't actually embody these ideas. And that's also a risk as well, and a risk with politicians of all types, because politicians are actors mostly. If anyone else wants to pick up on that.
Anyone else want to come in on that one?
I think it's definitely something that is a big risk in this space, and I've seen some of those critiques of Canada's approach as well, and I think that's really important to acknowledge. The flip side is that if there's no commitment, then we can't even hold countries accountable to that standard. So what it does, I think, is even though actually this was something that came through the research, there are really different ideas between governments and civil society about what a feminist approach would mean. And often civil society has significantly higher expectations for what that would look like, whereas sometimes governments have made an announcement and gone, no, I thought we'd just appoint some women ambassadors and we'd be done, like really different expectations. But what the commitment does, at least, is it gives you a standard to hold governments accountable to. And in the absence of that commitment, it's really hard to say, well, you know, for example, I write an assessment of Australia's aid budget every year with a feminist lens. We don't have a feminist approach, so there's no real incentive for the government to say, wow, we're not meeting our own standards, because it's not something that they've actually committed to yet.
So perhaps seeing it as a process, as a way that opens up a conversation with government, rather than seeing it as an endpoint in itself, something like that. Okay, well, the next question, if you don't mind, I'll stick with the Australian context for a moment because I then want to expand out. We have a question from Millicent Gadsby about what changes need to be made in the Australian context to begin to imagine feminist foreign policy here. Alice, Grant, if you'd like to go. Alice?
I can kick it off. Yeah, I think, so in terms of our research, what we would look for is a values-aligned political leader who's willing to be bold. And what I think we currently have is in the political system in Australia, we have a foreign minister, Marise Payne, who has stated that she is a feminist, which is more than Julie Bishop was able to do as foreign minister. She didn't ever align herself that way. Marise Payne does. And she makes gender equality a focus of many of her international engagements. So we have a values-aligned leader on that front. We also have a shadow minister, Penny Wong, who is a feminist and who has prioritised gender equality and other intersectional issues as part of her role. So we do actually have two values-aligned leaders. I think what we would need in the Australian context, and this is where our work has come in, is to create that enabling environment where a leader from any political party could really go out and make a bold announcement. Obviously, there are some other factors in the political systems and the overall ideologies of different parties that might make that more or less difficult. But I think what we're really trying to work on in Australia is creating that enabling environment. So raising awareness of the idea of feminist foreign policy, making the critique, making the case for where the gap is. So, you know, sometimes there's an assumption that, well, we're roughly doing this anyway, which is interesting because the other common argument against it is it would be really hard to do. It's so far away from what we're doing. So we get the argument from both sides. But yeah, I think it's that kind of change in the enabling environment. The other factor, I mean, and this is, I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for this. I do think it's trickier for women to announce feminist foreign policies. For men, I think that there's less backlash, and probably due to some of the factors that Grant mentioned. So I do think that that's something that makes it a little more challenging in the Australian context at the moment, ironically. But yeah, I think we have some of the conditions in place. So I think it's really just about creating that enabling environment. But Grant, you might want to add to that with your
perspective. I might go to Grant on enabling environment, because I mean, you talked in the international context about not promoting ideas that are too far ahead of a society. What's your view on Australian society? Is feminist foreign policy too far ahead for us?
Potentially. So, you know, we have adopted some of the assumptions. So in our development assistance program, there's an objective to make gender equality part of 80% of our assistance. So there is that assumption and the evidence that we've taken from that. Obviously, you know, the government won't call it feminist foreign policy. I think they're very shy of the word. That's another hurdle that we need to get across, and I don't think Australia is probably ready to jump that hurdle yet. But I think in terms of development assistance, that's the low-hanging fruit, I think, and you can see that in Canada as well with their development assistance. The next step is is the bigger ideas of feminist foreign policy, the ones about power, the ones about understanding the world in a different place, the ones about understanding security in a different place. I guess that's the next step, and I'm not sure whether we're there quite yet. I think we're, as I mentioned, the kind of great power politics, I think we're still very engaged in great power politics. We even, in the way that we view our region, like Southeast Asia, we still view this through competition with China, so we're still bound to this thinking, and it's going to take a lot to actually try and remove this from our mindsets.
Well, let me continue on with, where this fits in development assistance programs. So we have a question about, is feminist foreign policy in Western countries mired in a saviour project framing when we're talking about links with the global South? So I think everyone can respond on that. But I mean, Ambika, do you want to start us off?
I probably yes and no. If we look at it from a lens of assistance that's been coming to developing and underdeveloped countries over the last several decades, there is that lens has been applied. The concept of this, we know better, we've done this, our societies are better, and this is how you can be like us, kind of lens that's been applied. But if we look at it from the broader lens, I don't think so. We have, at least from our side, I would say, we've spoken to almost every single country that's announced a feminist foreign policy, with the exception of Libya and Chile, which was only 2 days ago, so give me a few days to talk to them. But we've spoken to people in the government that have been instrumental in that journey. And their goals, I don't see as that complex. And we cannot even say white savior complex, because there are countries that are very different. I don't think Mexico is coming from that lens at all, for example. And we've in fact learning quite a lot. So I feel like it's important to understand their approach, and for them to understand that approach makes sense in a certain context and not in every single context. And I do not absolutely feel that they think that their approach is the best one at all. Now, whether that translates in practice is, of course, something that we need to see. And that's where then, people like any of us come in, is to ensure that when it's being put into practice, for example, Canada's development assistance in South Asia, or Australia's in I don't know, anywhere in Africa, then we have ensured that and Alice or an Ambika ensures that this doesn't translate into practice in that sense, and we are pushing them on that issue. So I guess yes and no is the answer.
Well, I was really struck in the work you've been doing about the way you see feminist foreign policy as an area of partnership between Australia and India, for example. We've talked about lots of things we can do on the defence side, the supply chains, but actually thinking about what we can do as partners in something like feminist foreign policy, I think is fantastic. So thank you. So I might go to Grant and then finish up with Alice, because I think this will probably be our last one, unless we get one last question in there. If there's anyone who has got it on the tip of their tongue, this is your last opportunity.
Sorry. Yeah, I agree. I think that's, I think part of the problem is how do we export our values without exporting our values, if that makes sense? If that's the aim of foreign policy, especially our soft power and whatnot, how do we export our values without ramming them down people's throats? How do we actually make it a partnership and actually understand local conditions, and we actually have make it a conversation, and it's not just a quid pro quo, which used to be, I guess, the lens that especially international aid, was delivered through. It was, we'll give you this in order for this, you know, and that's not really a partnership, and it's not really a way that we should be conducting foreign policy.
Fantastic, thanks. Over to you, Alice.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and really it is one of the core tensions in this approach. I think there's sort of two sides to it that I see. So one is that Australia has not achieved gender equality, and you know, I'm sure there's much out there about that today, being International Women's Day. There are a lot of challenges on gender equality in Australia, and personally, I would not want to see us adopt a feminist foreign policy without action on some of those domestic challenges, because I do think that there's a real risk that if we were doing that, it just becomes patronizing, imperialistic, colonizing. It's that sort of sense that gender equality is something that, inequality is something that's a problem overseas, but something we've solved, which is absolutely not the case. So I do think it needs to go hand in hand with domestic action in order to have legitimacy. And I think that that's, you know, I'm sure that our partner governments in the region would view it in that way, that to have legitimacy for Australia, we need to be taking action on these issues here at home. I think the other side of it is that the point I made earlier, that there are women's rights movements in every country in the world who are leading this work in ways that resonate with the local culture, that really understand context, that are you know, so grounded in that the conversations and the norms that exist in those countries. And so, you know, I would see the role of a feminist foreign policy you know, in a similar way to the conversations about localization and decolonization of international development. It's not about coming in with the answers, it's about amplifying the solutions that already exist coming from the grassroots. And I think, you know, that's for a feminist foreign policy, funding those women's rights movements, because there is precious little funding available, and then really looking to amplify their work and amplify the issues that they're raising rather than coming in from the outside.
Yeah, what you've been saying there really resonates with me for work I did for the Asia Institute for the Melbourne Asia Review, looking at the way that Australia promotes human rights in Asia. So there's always the danger of being seen as hypocritical, because we will never be perfect in our implementation of human rights. I think it's around seeing these as common challenges. And I think that demands more of a peer model, for what it's worth, that we want to achieve these goals and we all, in our own unique ways, are failing to achieve these goals. How can we support each other to do better? Because these are goals that we really want to achieve. So I will leave with that. But look, this has been a fantastic discussion. As you can hear, we have experts who are so involved in these debates and who are pushing and advocating for real change. It's been a real pleasure on behalf of the Asia Institute to be able to host this today. The Asia Institute is the home of University of Melbourne's Asia experts, including fantastic work that's happening on gender across Asia. And I think on International Women's Day, it has been a pleasure and a delight to be able to welcome this fantastic panel today. A recording will be made available on the Melbourne Asia Review website. They are amazingly quick and efficient and will probably be up tomorrow. So if you know any friends who should have listened in, feel free to send them along the link and to tell them to come along to future Asia Institute events. So thank you again to all of our audience today and to our three superb speakers. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.